I just want to bring you some breaking news that we're getting this morning. We're just hearing that John Prescott has died. Former Deputy Prime Minister, of course. He'd be, about 86 years old. Lord Prescott, of course, as he became. We should say that John Oxley, political commentator, is here in the studio. We're talking about lots of things this morning, John, but just on this news. Now, I mean, he was an incredible figure in his own right, wasn't he? I mean, very much of the left, brought in to sort of satisfy the old Labour at the start of Tony Blair's new Labour, and in a way sort of worked in that role.
Yes, I think was always, famously tough. You know, we all remember him throwing a punch at someone who egged him in, I think, the 2005 election, and it was very popular throughout politics. I think very well respected. Someone who led a quite remarkable life, really sort of starting off on the ships in Hull, finding his way into union politics, but really coming from that old left background, flying the flag, I think often standing up to people like Tony Blair in cabinet and winning a lot of friends, even among those who didn't disagree with him. He was a big character and believed in what he believed in, and I think was very well respected.
Did that? I don't know if it happened before, but did it set a model that we've seen other parties follow or successive governments follow, as saying, well, whoever's in charge, well, we've got to have a deputy who's going to, in effect, represent the other side of the party?
It's something we've seen. I mean, the office of Deputy Prime Minister is a very odd one. We don't always have one. It doesn't have any official powers, but it is used, and particularly in the Labour Party, where they have this system where rather than being picked, they're elected, so you can balance them out. And that's something I think has worked quite successfully politically. And it's often quite good, I think, for a leader to have someone who is going to stand up to them and often helps their politics.
Mm-hmm. Mm. And as you say, a man with a real reputation. Also, I mean, it's got to be said, there was, pretty realistic arguments of champagne socialism, two jags and all sorts of issues. Maybe fell into the trappings of power a little bit.
Yes, there was always this other side to him. I think it was not just having two jags, but it was having them sort of take him 200 yards at the party conference from his hotel to the venue.
His wife had just had her head on.
Yes, but I think that was part of his charm, and I don't think he really tried to deny that. He was quite brash in that way, and sort of said, well, I've done quite well for myself. I've got here, and I'm going to enjoy it. And I think one of the things is particularly when he first went into Parliament, there were all sorts of stories of particularly some of the grander Tories taking the mick out of him. I think it was supposedly Nicholas Soames, who knew he'd been a waiter on a cruise ship and used to always shout, "Gin and tonic, please," whenever he saw him. And I think something we talk about now is bringing your whole personality to your job, and he is certainly someone who did that.
He was also a very strong supporter of Tony Blair initially.
Yeah.
Until, of course, they had a disagreement with regard to Iraq.
Yes, and I think, as part of that, he saw what was, regardless of his own political views and his own position in the party, I think he saw what Tony Blair was able to do to take the Labour Party back to power, and got on board very early with that, and benefited from being an ally, sometimes a critical ally. But yeah, it also points to the big rift that Iraq caused within the Labour Party sort of 15 years ago, 20 years ago now.
It's interesting, though, isn't it, when we look back at politicians who die, and the older politicians, you can't help but think, well, they don't make them like that anymore. I mean, because part of the thing with him, as you said before, was we sort of knew who he was, warts and all, and you don't get... Everything is much more spun now, isn't it? Whereas he really... You sort of got what you saw.
Yes, and I think there's now a lot more pressure, a lot more media spotlight, and all this sort of sense of media training and taking the edge off. But there still are some of these characters around, and often they tend to be the people that the public like most, because regardless of their background or sort of exactly what they stand for, the fact they just are who they are often cuts through better than people who try to really manipulate their image and try to be something they're not.
Well, there'll be lots of tributes coming in to John Prescott. And whether you agreed with his politics or not, he was certainly a character. We'll be reflecting that throughout the course of the programme. Look, we've got to talk about John Prescott, the former Deputy Prime Minister, who has died at the age of 86. James, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it was a bit of a shock this morning seeing it come up on the news. I knew him a bit from when he was campaigning with us, particularly in the 2017 election, and I know his son. He'd been unwell for quite a long time. He'd stopped going into the House of Lords recently, and he had Alzheimer's. And I think I saw the statement the family put out this morning, and they said, please don't send flowers, please give support to Alzheimer's research, which I think is a good message to take away from it.
Charlie?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good thing to take away from it. I mean, it's important to remember that, he was Tony Blair's Deputy Prime Minister for the whole 10-year period, which is, in today's politics, almost unheard of, where people have moved around and shuffled hitherto. And he was also, as Deputy Prime Minister, he was the local government minister, so he held a department as well as as well as being the Deputy Prime Minister. So he had a long time at the top of Labour Party politics, obviously known for his tough talking and his approach. We'll never forget, I think, that general election in 2001. I think we were talking outside a second ago, where he was egged by a protester and
punched him,
and ends up giving him a bit of a left hook, which actually I think endeared people to John, because that was his character.
Because the PM, Tony Blair, said at the time, "Oh well, John will be John."
Yes, yeah.
That was part of the appeal, wasn't it? That yes, a straight talking man, bit of a champagne socialist, you could argue, with the 2 Jags and all the rest of it, and protecting the wife's hairdo and what have you. But you sort of knew what you were getting.
Yeah, and he came up as a merchant seaman, came up through the union, and yes, as you say, he'd done well for himself in life. He was Deputy Prime Minister for 10 years. He was Deputy Leader of the Labour Party for a long time, but he'd still had. He has to have working class trade union values, and we saw that when I was working for Corbyn and for the party, and John was still around. So I think he kept those values, and that gave it something of an anchor into the New Labour project, which kept trying to veer off away from those things, and having him there was something holding it down.
And I think also finding what people underestimate John's involvement was that he was the glue between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. He was the peacemaker, the broker between the two. He organised lots of dinners, I think, back in Admiralty House, I think, where he was living at the time, just to try and get those two men round the table to agree on policy when relations broke down. So he really was, I think, integral to maintaining New Labour in Number 10, to keeping relations, even though we know they deteriorated publicly. But, he did as much as he could to keep the lid on that. And I think that's probably what hopefully some people close to Tony Blair and Gordon Brown will probably be saying later on throughout the day.
And he carried on playing that role. I think he was basically a party man through and through, because when Corbyn was leader and we were having problems as well, he would also try to mediate with other parts of the party, say, come on, we need to come together and all get on board and push in the same direction. And I think that was what he would always put first, was the idea that the party needed to be strong and united. And of course, a lot of the time it isn't, but people like that try to help it to be so.
Well, those are the days where they actually answer the questions, when you ask questions and the politicians actually appear to answer them instead of this obfuscation.
Sometimes.
Well, no, but I think that they don't make them like people like John Prescott anymore. I think the politicians these days are really career politicians, whereas he was really passionate about what he believed in and what he meant and how he felt about things, and you could see it. But these days, I think they're just enjoying the life of being politician rather than the issues.
Yeah, and I think that's he might have been an example to how maybe things are now. He might have been before his time in that regard, because you had Tony Blair, that was a great orator, obviously trained barrister, very careful with what he said. It was all a lot of PR that was continued under Gordon Brown. But certainly when David Cameron came in, it was all about PR, looking at a different field. And so politics has been about PR for a long time. And John back in the 90s and in the early 2000s was, as you say, plain spoken, said what he thought. But now you're seeing that again with Nigel Farage saying, exactly what he thinks. Lee Anderson, Angela Rayner's taken on maybe the mantle.
She did PMQs yesterday. I was actually at PMQs yesterday.
Oh,
and
how was it?
I heard Lee Anderson ask the question with regard to inheritance tax on the farmers and the quip that he made about Rachel Reeves's CV. Again, Angela didn't answer the question. This is how they keep going. They never answer any questions. I don't know why they bother calling it Prime Minister's questions, because there's literally no answers.
No, it's not. I mean,
Well, what's ever thus, though.
no,
Always.
PMQs is. I mean, I know Tony Blair wrote in his memoirs he used to feel physically sick before doing so, and I don't really understand why, because they can dodge the question. They've got a big bundle in front of them of everything, of all the answers that they can give, and I think we've moved on. Our politics has moved on because the ways in which people can be questioned and challenged has moved on. Parliament used to be extremely important for that because it was basically the only venue in which you could push and challenge ministers. And now, because they won't engage with them, and there are other fora where they can be challenged, including in the media, including social media and so on, it's more of a farce.
It's performative. It's performative. I was there. I mean, whilst we're on it, we could talk about an inheritance tax rate for farmers because
Charlie wants to stick up for the parliamentary game and...
you want to stick up for it?
I sort of, it's interesting that Tony Blair did feel sick about 3 minutes before 12 every Wednesday, but it was he that brought these... It used to be 15 minutes on a Tuesday and Thursday, and he consolidated it to half an hour on a Wednesday. So talk about inflicting, self-inflicting pain on yourself. But he was very good at it. But look, there's a problem for Angela Rayner because unlike, if we're comparing her to John, at least John, as we just talked about, did sort of try and answer the question. It's always going to be a bit more Punch and Judy when it's your deputies and not the main players. But Angela's getting into a bit of a situation, whether it's a deputy, where she's deputising for the Prime Minister, or whether it's her own departmental questions. There is a theme emerging where she holds on to the bundle that James was just talking about, and it is read word for word, so question, and there is a scripted answer. There's no flexibility to be able to say what we're actually doing or what we're not doing or what we're thinking about. There's no room for manoeuvre because some of our politicians either don't have a view or they don't know what the policy is or they're too frightened, maybe in the case of farming.
Dropping themselves in it.
Or dropping themselves in when there may be a U-turn. And because of the protests on Tuesday, which I think has galvanised the country, people have recognised that actually these are hard-working people. These people do not earn a huge living, our farmers. They farm their land. They're sitting on valued land, which is obviously valued as an asset.
But it's never realised.
But it's never realised because they're not selling it for property. Farmers today could just sell up and say, you know what, OK, yes, we'll pay a huge amount of tax for selling our land and turn it into property. But, where's your food going to come from?
Well, exactly.